first panel that we have with a specific focus on the role of experts in development. And all the more we were interested in his contribution to this series since when he told me several months ago that for the research he was conducting for this book, he was relying extensively on the historical scholarship on development. So it was interesting for us, for a humanities center, to have an event that would show how historical scholarship can contribute to the current public debate on the political economy of development. And this is also why I'm very pleased that as a commentator we have a historian, Professor Gregory Mann from the History Department at Columbia University. And again, Professor Mann is an expert of African history and especially of Western Africa history. He published a book in 2006, an award-winning book with Duke University Press, Native Songs, West African Veterans and France in the 20th Century, about the role that West African natives had in the French army and the consequences that these had for West African-French relations. And he's now working on a book forthcoming for Cambridge University Press entitled The End of the Road, Non-Governmentality in West African Sahel. So my last word is just an invitation to you all to join me in welcoming Professors Easterly and Mann.
Thank you very much, Michele. Let me first do a sound check. How is the microphone working? How is it in the gallery up there? Raise your hand if you cannot hear. That's the test. Anyone in your back? Raise your hand if you cannot hear. Okay, you're either very introverted or you can hear. So this talk tonight sort of came out of the pleasure I had of first meeting Michele quite a while ago and realizing that we had some common interests, namely the history of the idea of development. And I've learned enormously from the historians here at Columbia, specifically in this field. So what I'm giving tonight is not a general talk about any book or books that I may have recently published called The Tyranny of Experts, available from Amazon.
Well, available also.
Oh, sorry.
Outside of the door.
Oh my God, that was such a faux pas. I meant to say available right outside the door here from our wonderful independent bookseller. Let's give them our business. They're morally better. Sorry, that was the Amazon part was a joke, really. So the talk is focusing specifically on a historical section of the book on the history of the idea of development. And it's only about that history tonight. So if you want to hear about other parts of the book, there are two options. You could come to another talk. There'll be other talks in New York. And the other option is too obvious for me to mention, so I won't mention it again. So what's interesting about the history of the idea of development is that it does give us a lot of insight into where we are today in development. A lot of what the book is complaining about going on today is this sort of technocratic approach to development, in which the sort of prevailing model, to exaggerate and simplify a little bit, is sort of that we will have a bunch of experts in various fields advise the local autocrat on the technical solutions to material poverty, and we call that development. It's really quite an authoritarian model of development because we are kind of presuming that the autocrat is just this sort of benevolent autocrat that will take the advice of the experts and do all the technical fixes to the problems of the poor, such as, say, for a problem like malnutrition or vitamin deficiency, it's a simple technical fix like distributing very cheap vitamin A capsules. And so that's seemingly a a straightforward technical fix, but in our prevailing mindset, we hand these long lists of technical fixes over to autocrats because we work with a local government in power, usually autocratic. We don't spend a lot of time thinking about the rights of the poor, about the political rights of the poor, the human rights of the poor, their right to choose and consent what happens to them. It's almost as if we think of development as something that we, meaning the experts and the autocrats, do to the poor with or without their consent. Now, where did this very sort of technocratic approach to development come from? I'm going to argue tonight, and you're welcome to disagree, that it has some really interesting roots in the historical origins of the idea of development. Now, talking about the history of the idea of development is an interesting task, because one thing about development is it doesn't really admit that it has a history. Development people often talk as if they're the first ones ever to think about development. In fact, I can quote a very prominent one in that category. World Bank President Jim Kim in 2013, he said, "For the first time ever, we have a real opportunity to end extreme poverty within a generation." Now, the only point that I'm going to make about this statement is that it was actually not the first time ever that anyone had said the first time ever. In fact, you can trace, there was a great blog post on this by Owen Barter. You can trace back this phrase, or variations on this phrase, back about once a decade, very, very far back. I'm going to skip over a few decades and go back to a previous statement that said, "For the first time in history, humanity possesses the knowledge and the skill to relieve the suffering of these people." The kind of "these people" gives it away that's a little bit politically incorrect and sounds a little old. It was actually Harry Truman said this in 1949. And that was this is, for those who do have a historical mindset on the idea of development, this is sometimes taken as the origin of the idea of development, is this speech given by Harry Truman. That's sometimes taken as the origin. But actually, all the history that I'm going to talk about tonight all happens before this. And so let's go even a little bit earlier to another first time in history. For the first time in history, again, it was again even more kind of antiquated language. You can tell it's old, but it's the same idea. Experts are going to figure out how to relieve poverty and suffering. This one was actually said by Woodrow Wilson in 1919 at the Versailles talks. So development actually does have a long history, most of which it forgets. And we'll see maybe some motivations for wanting to forget in some of the history that we talk about tonight. So one theme that we're going to see in this history is that the technocratic idea that I described at the beginning is sometimes used as a distraction for talking about the rights of poor people that we don't want to talk about. So we prefer to talk about the technocratic ideas and not talk about the rights of poor people. The first example I'm going to give of that is actually in a place that is now pretty much forgotten as being one of the origins of the idea of development. It's pre-revolutionary China. We're going to start in China in the 1920s. How many of you saw that coming? China in the 1920s. It's so obvious that that's where development started. So in China in the 1920s, there was an awful lot of poor people's rights violations that we had to forget. There was a big, strong demand for technocratic ideas because there was an awful lot of rights violations that were happening right at that moment that we really did not want to talk about, we Western people who were trying to establish relations with the new Republic of China that had just come into being. So these include the fact that Woodrow Wilson had rejected a treaty that would certify equality of races at the Versailles talks. That was rejected by both the British and the Americans. So they explicitly rejected racial equality, which had been proposed by the Japanese. That happened in 1919. Then to make things worse, also at Versailles, the Western powers gave away Shantung province in China to the Japanese as an extraterritorial concession, a semi-colony of Japan. One reason they were okay with doing this is the Western powers had their own semi-colonies, also known as extraterritorial concessions in China. And these involved having your own, it was basically almost a colony in every word, but in everything but name. You had your own soldiers, you had your own police force, you had your own laws. Westerners residing there were protected by these police and soldiers and laws in these semi-colonial concessions. So all the Western powers, Britain, France, Germany, had these. Germany's was taken away and given to Japan. The Americans did not officially have one of their own, but they enjoyed all the privileges of being expatriates in the other extraterritorial zones. But the Americans had just committed another one of their own racial sins. They had just passed in 1924 the Oriental Exclusion Act, which was an explicit prohibition on Asian immigration to the United States made for explicitly racist reasons. This was, remember, at a time when people were not ashamed to make openly racist statements about anyone who was not European, and that was the explicit justification for the act. We don't want anyone but Europeans, whites only for immigration to America. So this was an insult to both Japan and China. I'm going to talk about China in particular. So we're basically violating, we being Americans, and the two Western powers I'm going to talk the most about tonight are America and Britain. So, oh, Joe, we'll find you a seat, don't worry. Right here, right here. Yeah.
Okay, bye. Sorry.
So we're basically violating the rights of Chinese in every possible way we could think of in the 1920s. But we didn't really want to kind of openly admit it. We kind of were somewhat aware this was going to kind of create tensions with the Chinese. So what we decided to talk about instead was technocratic development of China, the technocratic approach to development of China. So at a 1929 conference that was held in Tokyo of something called the Institute for Pacific Relations, which was a big think tank bringing together Western experts and Asian experts, the research secretary said, the presence of foreign soldiers and force upon Chinese soil, the existence of powerfully organized foreign settlements with their own organs of government and police power, all of these loom very large in Chinese eyes. So Condillac realized that all of these were major insults to the Chinese. So the beginning of the technocratic response was one historian named James Shotwell, who had been an advisor to Woodrow Wilson at the Versailles talks. And he gave the technocratic response. Now, one of the genius of technocrats is compared to the kind of like excitement and tragedy of rights violations, technocrats are skilled at making things sound very, very boring. So the quotes from technocrats are going to sound really boring, which is intentional. They want you to just fall to sleep and forget about all those rights violations that I just talked about. So James Shotwell said, the only concern at present on the part of any foreign government is only juristic, not political. We had a conference in 1921 which put together an international commission to study the question of Chinese extraterritoriality and recommend specific proposals for a juristic reform on China, upon the completion of which the powers would relinquish their extraterritorial claims. Did you get all that? Did you get the boring part? So basically he's saying the problem is technical, not political. Once the technocrats reform the Chinese judicial system well enough, then we could give Chinese back their rights. He didn't want to say it in those exact words, but it was purely a technical problem. And again, the theme always in these technocratic approaches is solve the technocratic problems first, and then we can talk about rights later. And that's the effective way to try to distract from the rights violations. Some Chinese economists were persuaded to go along with this. And so there was a Chinese economist who was very well connected to the Chiang Kai-shek government of China at that time. And he would express best the technocratic idea of development at the 1929 conference. By the way, on the second day of the conference, the stock market crashed and the beginning of the Great Depression began. They did not know that at the time. Some people think that development was a reaction to the Great Depression, but a lot of these ideas were already in place before the Great Depression. So here is his idea of how the technocratic approach to development. This is Mr. Wu, from a Chinese economist. Here is his idea of how the technocrats can kind of smooth over all these hard feelings about racial prejudice and inferiority and superiority and rights violations and occupation of China by semi-colonial powers. He said, the writer begs to lay before the public the following proposition: the government of China will request the League of Nations to appoint an international commission on the economic development of China. The commission will make its own investigation of conditions, blah, 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 for carrying out of the plan at an early date, with the commission working on such a comprehensive, scientifically formulated, progressive, and practical plan of economic development, public support and ultimate success are assured. It actually was not assured at all, but we'll get to that later. The Chinese people should understand that the League of Nations, of which China itself is a member, is an organization for the promotion of international peace and goodwill, not a combination of governments for selfish aggression. International cooperation through the agency of the League, therefore, is not the same as having those foreigners control our national economy. So here he had already invented the idea of sort of the technocratic smoothing over of any unpleasantness associated with rights violations by Westerners and the lack of recognition of the rights of the Chinese. Now, what we're going to see over and over again is we're going to see kind of a coalition of three groups that would be sort of come together for this idea of authoritarian development. The three groups would include three very distinct interests, two of them in Western countries and one of them local. So the three groups are going to be Western humanitarians, Western foreign policy interests, which was already represented here by James Shotwell saying, trying to make a rights violation just into a technical problem, and local autocrats, whom we're going to meet in a moment. So the humanitarian interests at this point already involved the Rockefeller Foundation. And they had put together this group that I mentioned earlier called the Institute for Pacific Relations, which is meant to be this group of technocrats working for the development of China and other Pacific nations. The Rockefeller already had some ideas about work in China that sound very, very modern. They said that advances in one area, such as health, were so dependent on the progress in other fields, such as industry, agriculture, education, and transportation, that it should be closely coordinated with a program of national planning. Rockefeller was going to bring together social scientists, public health experts, engineers, and agronomists for a concerted attack on China's rural problems. 30 years later, this would be reinvented as the theory of the big push in the 1950s. And then half a century later, that would be rediscovered again by Jeff Sachs as the big push and the Millennium Villages in Africa. But here, this is already present in the Rockefeller Foundation in the 1920s and 30s in China. Now, the Rockefeller Foundation was picking up on something one of the members of the Institute of Public Relations had already kind of stumbled upon for a study of race relations on the West Coast between Asians and white Americans, where there's a lot of prejudice and hostility towards Asians on the West Coast. Ray Wilbur, the president of Stanford University, had chaired a 1923 survey of race relations in which he suggested the technocratic solution was the answer. He said, if you could just show that the Japanese agricultural laborers were useful to the local economy, that both the locals and the Japanese workers materially benefited from their presence in local agriculture, the idea was if you could just get every group to forget about their rights and concentrate on the material benefits of what was going on the West Coast, then that would solve the problem of racial prejudice and discrimination and hostility between races. So Rockefeller sort of applied that idea in founding the Institute of Pacific Relations for relationships with China as well. And to give you an idea of Rockefeller's attitudes towards Rockefeller's own attitudes as it was formulating these very modern technocratic development ideas, I can tell you just as a little bit of evidence the way that Rockefeller itself treated the Chinese fellows that it financed in the United States. So Rockefeller had a program for financing Chinese fellows to study and learn and spread knowledge in the United States. But there were a few things that were kind of like little giveaways that maybe Rockefeller did not quite get the concept that Asians and Europeans should be treated equally. One is that the Chinese fellows received a much lower stipend than European fellows for Rockefeller. Second is that the most senior Chinese fellows received the same stipend as the most junior Chinese fellows. Apparently Chinese were Chinese to Rockefeller. Sorry to be so offensive, but these are the times. These are the racist times that we're talking about in the 1930s. And third, the Rockefeller Foundation policed the Oriental Exclusion Act. It made very sure that the Chinese fellows returned home immediately after they finished their fellowship and did not try to immigrate to America. So they were one of the enforcers of the Oriental Exclusion Act. So what about the Western foreign policy interests? Well, I've already given you some hint that the US was very happy that Rockefeller was talking about technocratic development in China and not about the rights violations implied by extraterritorial occupation of China or by the ban of Chinese immigration to the US. That went on for a long time, that these ideas were very convenient to kind of hide these racial inequities. And then, of course, lots more was about to happen. Japan invaded China. Japan and the US went to war a little bit later in something now known as World War II. And the US was actually quite glad that there had already been a lot of work in pre-revolutionary China at the time of World War II, because now they wanted to enlist China as an ally against the Japanese, a local ally against the Japanese. And just as in, so America very badly needed an economically successful economically successful China to defeat Japan. It needed a beneficent image for its local ally, Chiang Kai-shek, who was actually a pretty bad guy who used gangs to kill his political opponents, and whose officers pocketed the pay of his soldiers and left his soldiers starving. Very corrupt and very authoritarian. But they needed a beneficent image. So all the work that Rockefeller had done on technocratic development allowed them to present this image, this fantasy of what was called Free China now in the 1940s as an ally of the US. Chiang Kai-shek was heading something called Free China. Which, of course, at this point was completely a fantasy, which was a corrupt autocracy where Westerners themselves were also violating the rights of the Chinese through the extraterritoriality. It was pretty much a nation builder's fantasy that was analogous to later nation builders' fantasies like today's Afghanistan, or today's Iraq, or a few decades ago, Vietnam. It's pretty much been the same idea all along. Today we call it fixing failed states, or nation building. In the 40s, it was grandiosely called Free China, was our fantasy of a nation that was on our side. So now we can see sort of the appeal of the technocratic ideas. If you have the fantasy that an autocrat is not only your wartime ally, but is also developing Free China, is alleviating material poverty in Free China, that makes it much more easy to sell to the American public the idea that your ally is a good guy. It's doing both development of China and is on your side in a war. This is going to be a lasting combination of this sort of, makes possible what would be a lasting combination in development of allying humanitarian interests who want development with national security interests who want to protect the foreign policy and national security interests of the United States. That alliance still exists today. And China, pre-revolutionary China, was one of the places this alliance first originated, the alliance of humanitarians and national security interests. We have pretty much the same alliance today in Afghanistan, for example. So the only part we have left is to explain the role of the local autocrats. Why did they like technocratic development ideas? Well, because, of course, it made them the star. They were the ones developing China. Chiang Kai-shek was the one developing China. It was actually Chiang Kai-shek's predecessor, Sun Yat-sen, who had first come up with a national plan for the development of China, which was probably the first development plan ever, the first technocratic development plan ever that he came up with back in 1918. And Chiang Kai-shek had inherited that. The Rockefeller Foundation had worked with that when they were doing all their work in China in the 20s and 30s. They continued that into the 40s to justify the technocratic image of Chiang developing China. And there were Chinese economists who were the first development economists. Some of the first development economists were Chinese economists working on the Chinese National Development Plan, which before 1939 took as its models Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia as kind of models. They didn't, of course, this is kind of unfair. They didn't really know how awful these models were going to look a few years later, but that was kind of the mindset. So, you know, if we're going to be really blunt about things, what was really free China was really more like fascist China compared to the alternative communist China, which would later win the Civil War. But the economists were very successful in kind of presenting a much more benevolent image of this autocratic regime in China, with only occasional dissents. There was one Chinese economist that I found in an extensive search of any Chinese economists who might have dissented. There were a few dissenters. So there was an economist named Yuan Li Wu, who gave a critique of all of this. It was not published until 1946. It got no attention whatsoever from the American supporters of free China. Wu diagnosed why plans were attractive to Chiang and to his American supporters because it gave Chiang a lot of power. And it enabled Chiang, in Wu's words, it left all the politics out of the planning narrative. It presented a development as a planning technocratic problem with left all the politics out. What Wu called the struggle for wealth and power, which he said tends to be conducted unscrupulously. So Wu was one of the few people who, at this time, who realized benevolent autocrats are not benevolent. And he said, any system conducive to an overconcentration of power in a few hands is dangerous from the point of view of economic welfare. And moreover, Chinese democracy had little chance under a system of economic regimentation and central direction of investments, which tends in all circumstances to undermine political democracy. And his reward was to be completely ignored and forgotten. I may be one of the first Westerners to ever quote his writings. It's very sad. So, of course, you all know the ending in pre-revolutionary China. Free China was not strong enough to resist Communist China, and Communist China won the Civil War, and it was all over, and this was all completely forgotten in the history of development. So that's the end of the first story of sort of the marriage of humanitarians, foreign policy interests, and autocrats behind the idea of a kind of authoritarian approach to development. Now, the second story is going to be British colonial Africa. This will be the second and final story. There'll be a very third brief story on Colombia at the end. British colonial Africa, of course, had fairly obvious rights violations that it wanted to overlook also. Most of all, that the African subjects of the British Empire had no rights under the British Empire. Moreover, in certain parts of the British Empire, they were being dispossessed by European settlers. There was a specific flaring up in 1925 in Kenya when white settlers were taking away the locals' lands, and there was the brewing of an indigenous rebellion against the settlers. And once again, the technocratic ideas came to the rescue. A British missionary proposed to the Rockefeller Foundation a survey, once again trying to deal with a problem of one race violating the rights of another race, with once again what would be met with was the assembly and the dispassionate study of the facts. If only we could get a technocratic approach to relieving the material poverty of the natives, maybe they would not notice so much that their rights were being violated by European settlers. So again, it would just be the usefulness of this technocratic idea to change the subject away from rights violations. So this survey took a while to come together. it was finally published in 1938, a volume of 1,831 pages. If you don't want to buy my book, I recommend you buy this book instead, 1,831 pages. It's available on eBay. It's called An African Survey. Try to get the original 1938 version. I have it in my office. The African Survey announced a more scientific approach to the problems of health and material well-being in Africa. It sounds very modern, a very modern phrase, as if it came out of the Poverty Action Lab. And it had some very specific suggestions which sound very familiar. So here's an example of 4 different technical solutions that were proposed by the African Survey in 1938 to 4 different problems. I'm not going to read the slide to you because hopefully you can all see it. So for 4 different problems, the African Survey's technical answer in 1938 was exactly the same as that of another mammoth technical survey that would be done 70 years later by the United Nations. Another large team of technical experts led by, I'm forgetting who, I think it may have been Angelina Jolie, but I'll check again on who the author of the UN survey was in 2005. May have been somebody here at Columbia, you never know. So anyway, this UN survey, exactly the same technical answers as in 1938. For 4 different problems: malaria, malnutrition, soil erosion, and clean water. The exact same technical answers. So this tells us a couple of things. One is the technocratic approach is remarkably persistent. And it's remarkably persistent despite having failed, because obviously if the technical answers were already available 70 years ago and are still cited as being in need of remedy 70 years later, they were not done over the preceding 70 years. I think that's a fair conclusion. They did not succeed in solving the problem over the intervening 70 years. So what the technocratic ideas were very useful for was justifying the British Empire, as usual. So again, it's this, to go back to this idea, it's again this, now in the British case, it's going to be an alliance of British humanitarians who are being reassured that the colonial subjects are having their problems solved with British foreign policy interests, which is just like maintain the empire. And then we'll get to the role of local autocrats in a moment. So this became even more useful during World War II, when the Americans were not quite sure whether, we're kind of hesitating for a while when they were allied with the British, whether it was really their job to also defend the British Empire against Japan, which is, the British Empire in Asia was under assault by Japan. There was some question that Africa also might side with, against the British because they were being oppressed by the British colonialists. And so the Americans were not sure which way to go on this. Do we help the British Empire defend itself and its colonies, or do we call for the end of the empire, maybe in a kind of evolutionary way after the war? Well, the British had already had lots of practice defending their own empire as a technocratic enterprise that was solving the problems of the locals in this way that is depicted in this slide. During World War II, they actually wrote out a memo saying, within the British Colonial Office, they wrote out a memo saying that these kind of technocratic plans would enable His Majesty's government, this is a quote, to resist far more effectively and convincingly any tendency to rush them into making undesirable concessions to impatient hotheads. Those were their words, who might want like rights for Africans or anything outrageous like that. And the British, they said, you know, we can justify the empire with these technocratic ideas. The Secretary of the State for the Colonies, Mr. Stanley at that time, read the memo. Today, the Secretary of State for the Colony is called the Secretary of State for Development. That's a joke. The Secretary of State for the Colonies, Mr. Stanley, read the memo, and he wrote a cover note, which I still have a photostatic copy of that you can see on the internet. I just have the 3-word cover note that he gave for the technocratic justification of the British Empire. Simply this. This is great. And what's more, this argument actually worked very well with the Americans. because there was a British colonial official named Lord Hailey who went on the offensive with the Americans, who basically said, you know, if you start harping on how we're oppressing our non-white subjects, we're going to start, you know, letting slip how you oppress your non-white citizens who did not have the full right of citizens, namely American blacks, African Americans. And he had actually done his homework, because during the New Deal, Eleanor Roosevelt had actually had lunch with a black leader named Ralph Bunche and suggested to him in 1940 that racism, in Eleanor's words, was most effectively attacked on the economic front. He said that you know, the blacks should concentrate on the attainable goal of economic progress and to postpone the challenge to segregation. So this was the default approach of the Roosevelt administration, because they needed the vote of Southern whites. I mean, they're not bad guys, they're just constrained by political realities. They needed the vote of Southern whites. That was the bedrock of the Democratic Party for Roosevelt to get elected. So they had to somehow keep the Southern whites happy with the system of segregation and oppressing blacks with unequal rights, while somehow keeping blacks happy with the idea that, the familiar idea once again, if you'll please just forget about your rights, we'll really have enthusiastic technocratic solutions to all your material problems. And you know, just that's the deal. If you accept that deal is sort of still on offer in development today. You know, if poor people in Africa will just forget their rights, we offer you material development. So Lord Hailey had trumped the Americans on this one. The Americans realized that they could be embarrassed on their own problems of oppressing their own non-whites, on their own racial, frequent racist expressions. And so for the moment, they agreed to go along with the British Empire. All based on the supremacy of the technocratic idea. In fact, this continued even with the founding of the United Nations. There was nothing in the UN Charter that said anything about independence for colonies. There are beautiful statements about human rights declarations and lots of other wonderful, beautiful language. There's nothing about independence for the colonies. The only thing the UN Charter said was that some UN members, namely Britain and France, have responsibilities for the administrations of territories whose peoples have not attained yet a full measure of self-government. And these members were required to ensure that the peoples of these territories were protected against abuses. Those were their words, protection against abuses. So who would be doing the abuses? The colonial power. Who was protecting them against their abuses? Colonial power. So the colonial power was required to protect colonial subjects against themselves, against the colonial power's own oppression of the colonial subjects. That was as far as we got in 1947 in the UN Charter. Now, of course, we know now that the British Empire ended very, very soon after that, but it was actually, all of this was going on when nobody expected the British Empire to end. One British colonial officer said that they did not expect independence to come to Africa for centuries. Another one proposed a super gradualist plan in which the first step was something totally meaningless, and even the first step would take many generations for that to happen. So what happened was just an unexpected collapse of the British Empire that happened through lots of things that we don't have time to talk about now. That was not anticipated at all at the time that we're talking about these ideas. So after that happened, I keep coming back to this idea that there's an alliance between, that local autocrats also like the idea. Of course, the local autocrats during the British colonial empire were just the colonial power themselves. But after the end of the British Empire, there was a new set of autocrats that found the ideas of technocratic development quite appealing, and that was the new local autocrats of the new independent countries, because the technocratic ideas gave them justification for unlimited power. It justified their power after the end of colonialism. So ironically, these racist and colonialist ideas that had originally been the inspiration for technocratic development ideas appealed to the anti-racist and anti-colonialist autocratic leaders who came along after the end of colonialism, because it gave them unchecked power. So an example of this is the interaction between Sir Arthur Lewis, one of the first kind of officially well-known development experts who would later get the Nobel Prize in economics for his development work, with Kwame Nkrumah, the first ruler of independent Ghana. So Arthur Lewis, after Ghana became independent in 1957, Arthur Lewis flew in and started advising Nkrumah on how to do development under this technocratic idea that all I have to do is give the expert recommendations, and then Nkrumah will put them into practice, and everything will be fine. Unfortunately, Arthur Lewis quickly realized he was much more honest than some of our development experts today working with autocrats. He actually did have very strong democratic principles, Sir Arthur Lewis, and he quickly realized the abuses of power that the technocratic ideas made possible. He said in a private letter to a correspondent already in 1958, he said, "The fascist state, meaning in Ghana, is in full process of creation, and I find it hard to live in a country where I cannot protest against imprisonment without trial." So he pretty quickly ended his term in Ghana. He resigned quietly. He didn't make a big deal out of it. He was afraid of sort of hurting the cause of African independence, so he kept quiet. He later wrote a very good book that was published in 1965 called Politics in West Africa, in which he explicitly denounced the big man complex of autocrats who are ruining Africa. And he said, quote, "We should remember what we read when we read it in the political science books about the charisma of the great men now engaged in modernizing backward societies. We should remember the whole apparatus of repression, the one-party state, the cult of the leader, and the opportunities for corruption." Now, unfortunately, this book of Lewis is never cited. We cite all of his other writings about the surplus labor and about the idea of raising the rate of investment as the key to development. We cite all of those ideas. But you can test this on Google Scholar. If you go check on Google Scholar which works of Lewis are cited, there are millions of sites of surplus labor and raising the rate of investment to drive development, the technocratic ideas. But this book, Politics in West Africa, which admitted the truth about how technocratic ideas had justified political repression, is never cited and has been completely forgotten. So we're nearing the end now of this story. I'm going to give you one final example, which will kind of give us the transition to the modern era that we live in today. So I'm going to just talk about Colombia very briefly as kind of the transition to the modern era of development. And I'm going to talk about Colombia by talking about three different events that all happened on one day in Bogota, Colombia, on April 9th, 1948. The first thing that happened is the World Bank president was in town in Bogota, and he met with the Colombian president, and they agreed that the World Bank would do its first country report ever on Colombia, bringing all the technocratic ideas of development that I've already been talking about and applying them to development. And the World Bank report would come out a short time afterwards, and again use one of those kind of first time ever formulations. The quote was, "Colombia is presented with an opportunity unique in its long history." It's just another version of the first time, for the first time ever, Colombia can develop. Now, this was not the only game in town. There was also a national security interest at stake in Colombia. As far as Western foreign policy interests, U.S. Secretary of State George Marshall, as in, Mr. Marshall Plan George Marshall, he was in town for the founding meeting of the Organization of American States, which was a Cold War alliance against the Soviets. It was an alliance of Latin American states with the U.S. against the Soviets. And so the Cold War was just beginning at this time, and Mr. Marshall was very eager to have the Colombian rulers on their side and all the other Latin American rulers on their side. Now, was this the usual alliance of humanitarians, foreign policy experts, and local autocrats? Were there local autocrats? Well, unfortunately, there would be local autocrats because of something else that happened on April 9th, 1948. Colombians do not think of April 9th, 1948 as the day when a World Bank report was commissioned. That did not go down in Colombian history as the reason to remember April 9th. nor do they remember it as the date of the organizing meeting of the Organization of American States to protect U.S. interests in the Cold War. That did not make a big impression on Colombians. What did make a big impression on Colombians is that day an assassin killed the Liberal Party presidential candidate, Jorge Gaitan, and that was the beginning of a hugely violent and autocratic period in Colombian history that is simply known as La Violencia, in which some really bad guys were in power in Colombia, but they were our bad guys. They were bad guys on the US side in the Cold War. And so this Colombia is sort of the transition into the Cold War period of this technocratic alliance of humanitarians that are seeing the development of Colombia happen through the technocratic ideas, foreign policy interests that have a reliable autocrat on our side in the Cold War, and then the local autocrat who's very happy to have a World Bank report justifying his violent autocratic rule in Colombia. And so that's kind of the transition to the modern era that we live in. So here's kind of like a real quick summary of where we've been today. We started with Woodrow Wilson talking about development, which was in 1919, which was actually, he was explaining the concept of League of Nations mandates, which were colonies except with technocratic ideas. We went through China and Sun Yat-sen and U.S. support for Chiang Kai-shek's dictatorship. We went through British colonial Africa, and then we finished up in the World Bank report on Colombia and U.S. support for the Colombian autocrat in the Cold War. And then today we sort of wind up with this continued marriage of sort of humanitarians, national security, and local autocrats that continued through the 60s and the 60s through the 80s as the Cold War went on. It seemed to go away for a little while after the end of the Cold War. But then today with the war on terror, once again we need, the US and the war on terror once again needs autocratic allies. So once again today in the war on terror we have these ideas of humanitarian military intervention, fixing failed states, giving aid to autocratic allies in the war on terror, such as Ethiopia and Uganda, not to mention getting along quite happily for a while with Russia and China because they were also on our side in the war on terror. So having sort of all the autocrats on your side in the war on terror, again, very convenient marriage of technocratic ideas of development that enables us to assemble this large coalition of we don't mess with the local autocrats, we forget the rights of local peoples that may be violated by these autocrats, such as major human rights violations perpetrated by all of the guys listed in Iraq, Afghanistan, including our own rights violations in the form of civilian casualties and drone killings and so on, and human rights violations by Ethiopia, Uganda, Russia, and China. Now, let me give you a somewhat happier update. While technocratic development was having such a strong influence for so long as an excuse for neglecting the rights of poor people. And by the way, this history I'm trying to say is relevant, but I'm not trying to say it automatically disqualifies the technocratic ideas. Because these ideas, we need to have another debate on sort of whether these ideas really work to achieve development. We don't have time to really talk about that tonight. I'm going to argue they don't. And in another talk, I would have argued they don't work and that free societies actually work better than autocratic societies with technocratic experts. But we don't have time for that debate tonight. But it's not fair to kind of tarnish technocratic ideas only with their kind of bad historical origins. But it is kind of relevant for us to be aware of how repeatedly this theme has surfaced, of using the technocratic ideas as an excuse to change the subject away from the rights of poor people. That's really the big theme that I'm trying to get across with this whole historical exercise is simply that. Through almost 100 years now, we've over and over again used technocratic ideas. We found them over and over again convenient to change the subject away from the subject of the rights of poor people, their human rights, their political rights. We don't have to talk about those rights because we have this grand alliance that converges on these technocratic ideas. Now, the only happier news is that despite all this, the citizens of the rest of the world on their own have been resisting authoritarian ideas anyway, because they want their own rights anyway. And so rights have been spreading around the world, and sometimes with some Western encouragement. Let's be fair to those who are promoting rights in the West, but often because local people are seizing them for themselves. So let me give you a couple of updates on stories that we already talked about that are somewhat happier. The Kuomintang Party, the Nationalist Party of Chiang Kai-shek, had moved to Taiwan after they lost the Civil War in China in 1949. As of 1996, there was, for the first time in history, an ethnic Chinese nation held free elections, and it was in Taiwan. There was a democratic revolution in Taiwan. So the Kuomintang winds up now today competing in democratic elections in Taiwan. It's a somewhat happier history. An update on the colonial Gold Coast and British West Africa and today's Ghana. Ghana has also progressed. Ghanaian citizens have demanded for themselves more democratic rights, and Ghana has now held 4 successive free and fair competitive elections as of 2012. Of course, back in mainland China, there's lots more economic freedom than there used to be, a little more political freedom than there used to be under Mao, which may explain some of the economic growth that has happened in China from a very low base. Still a long way to go. There was one Chinese dissident named Chen Guangcheng who said he did not believe in benevolent autocrats. We Chinese must fight for our own rights. We cannot expect an enlightened emperor to bestow our rights upon us. But let me close with these inspirational words that Chen hoped for freedom. As more and more Chinese people speak out and demand their rights, as more and more poor people around the world speak out and demand their rights despite the technocratic alliance against them, change will become unstoppable. So my final conclusion is simply that authoritarian technocratic development has carried the day for nearly 100 years. 100 years has been enough. It's time for it to be over. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Great.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you for that talk. And I'm going to respond just very briefly. And our introductory comments abolished, I think, the idea of experts here at the table. And I'll certainly, I'll agree to that. I don't want to be a master or a guru either, so I'll just say that I'm probably the amateur in the room in any case. A simple, humble historian, right? But I want to pick up on some of the things that William Easterly was saying towards the end of his talk. For those of you who haven't yet had a chance to read the book, which of course is on sale if your local bookseller. The book being about...
Thank you. Say more.
The book being about a debate that never happened, or that was over by 1950. A debate on the question of freedom within development that has never fully been carried out. There was a debate, William Easterly demonstrates, between the idea of state intervention versus the manipulation of markets, but never truly a debate on individual rights. And what Easterly argues is that the market versus government debate is in fact the wrong debate to be had, and the individual rights versus state power debate is the right one to have, and the necessary one, the one that we must have now. The contours of the argument, very briefly, and I think this is a powerful assertion that's made early in the book, is that morally neutral approaches to development do not exist. Again, morally neutral approaches to development do not exist. I'd like to hear more about this, and I'm going to ask you this. The key argument of the book is that technocratic approaches, as you just heard, the technocratic approaches to development assume a benevolent autocrat. And Easterly argues the first part of that assumption is both ethically dubious and very often incorrect, that autocrats are very rarely, if ever, benevolent. But for the most part of the period referred to as the development decades, the second part, the idea that you're going to be dealing with an autocrat, is unfortunately a very safe assumption, and it's even an empirically observable assumption. If then the equation is no autocrat means no development aid, then it would seem to be the result of that would be there's no development aid. What to do about that seems to me to be something of a conundrum, in that your technocrats, your development agents, your international agencies don't always choose their interlocutors, but might make do with what they have. Is there no gray area or middle ground in these points, between these 2 points? The other key argument of the book is that, and I'm paraphrasing here, is that the real cause of poverty is the unchecked power of the state against poor people without rights. And Easterly means both political and economic rights when it refers to rights. The unchecked power of the state against poor people without rights. There's hope, Easterly argues, from new research, which puts an emphasis on history and the dynamics of history, and I'll return to that, that recognizes the significance of non-national actors in inducing economic growth and development. Here he uses the Maurides as an example, the Senegalese Sufi Brotherhood of the Maurides. And the third source of new research in which he sees cause for optimism are the emergence of kind of spontaneous solutions to long-standing problems within development. Spontaneous solutions within markets, in the political sphere, and also via new technologies. So let me return to history and spontaneous solutions. I realize this is not, perhaps strictly speaking, I hope you'll forgive me, it's not a history book, although it does a lot of work with history. Reading it as an historian, I certainly recognize that it resonates in many ways with contemporary African history, in which the idea of modernization and also modernism and development had acute effects at the precise moment of independence, circa 1960, in which the plans are big and ambitious. The cadres who were capable of carrying them out were very few, and there was a great reliance on experts from the outside, either from former colonial metropoles, from the USSR, the Eastern Bloc, or from the World Bank, the US, etc. I wonder if there aren't a couple missing chapters here, chapters that I would have myself liked to see. One would be a chapter on socialism itself, which Easterly does not exactly leapfrog. There's a good deal of discussion about Kwame Nkrumah and the often overlooked Lewis, in which he argues persuasively that technocratic vision had become hegemonic by the early 1960s. This brought to mind to me, and I thought I'd take the liberty of citing it since we are, after all, in the Heyman Center for the Humanities, a passage from Aimé Césaire's letter to Maurice Thorez, the head of the French Communist Party, in which he quits the Communist Party in 1956, in which he argues that in Europe, usurping bureaucracies are cut off from the people and have achieved the pitiable wonder of transforming into a nightmare what humanity has for so long cherished as a dream. This seems to me that quote was to me evoked, the idea that what had so long been cherished as a dream was transformed into a nightmare via this kind of technocratic vision, as it was attempted to be realized in the 1960s and 70s in places like Ghana and Tanzania under Ujamaa. The second missing chapter is quite a different one, would be maybe a chapter on neoliberalism, which I don't think as a term actually appears in the book. Although it appears in many a book of anthropology, history, and the disciplines that are not the economic disciplines. Perhaps they misapprehend the term. But the proliferation of NGOs, which is often associated with the neoliberal moment in Africa, as potentially direct and spontaneous or connected efforts towards development, is not necessarily democratic, and is often oriented towards defending particular rights, which the people on the ground, or the supposed objects of improvement, do not get to choose. That is, the rights themselves, they don't get to choose. However, I wonder if I could hear some thoughts about neoliberalism, if that would change a little bit the uneven balance that now I think obtains in the book between the technocratic approach, which empowers outside actors, although Easterly in the book actually points to the state explicitly, versus the neoliberal practice of diminishing state capacity. So is the state, in fact, the enemy, as it were here, or the counterpart, even? It seems to me not entirely clear. I had more to say about the work of history in the book, but I think I'll skip over the work that the Atlantic slave trade does to support certain points within the book. And let me go to the third kind of stream of new research that Easterly sees as giving cause for optimism, which is the emergence of spontaneous solutions. And here's a kind of affirmative argument in the book made with the example of Green Street in Soho as the sort of doing the work of carrying the argument through. An argument for the recognition that free society is a great problem-solving system, and that this takes a long time to elaborate. And the argument essentially, it seems to me, is that stumbling toward development or growth in a non-directed way is in fact the right way to go. If there's a prescription here, it seems to me to wait for the spontaneous to happen. Which, it's to me, to go back to the idea of the conundrum, raises a question of what happens in the meantime. And the book opens with a set of racing examples, one involving Uganda, another involving Bill Gates' trumpeting of the decline of infant mortality in Ethiopia, balanced against the autocratic figure of the late Meles Zenawi, who was the Prime Minister of Ethiopia at the time. What happens as we wait for the spontaneous to happen? It seems to me that stumbling can take a very long time, and that's something that's struck me both in the talk this evening and in the book itself. The ideas presented in the slides, for example, insist that now is the time, and of course the now shifts, but it's always the time. There's a sense of emergency, of urgency, of an imminent horizon. You see this in the Millennium Development Goals, of course. You see it in modernization in the earlier period. You see it certainly at the time of African independence, and you see it in the idea of the possibility of leaping forward. That the horizon is imminent, that the moment is now, and that it must be seized. And so what's striking then about the book in relation to that set of ideas, which it seems to me flows through so many discussions around development and possibility, is that what the book truly counsels, and I wonder if you'll agree or disagree with this, it seems to me it counsels patience above all else. But I wanted to return to this point of whether or not that patience in and of itself might be an agonizing choice to have to make. That seems to me something of an ethical conundrum that launches the book and for me was sustained throughout the book. So those were the comments I wanted to offer, the question of the conundrum and the question of patience in particular. And then I don't know if you feel that there are possibilities for talking about either neoliberalism or African socialism as either cases in point or if they would change in some way the argument. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So why don't you give an initial
response?
Yes,
we'll
and then we'll open
okay.
the floor.
Okay, thank you for those very thoughtful comments. I want to try to keep my own response short, so to leave room for more discussion. So let me focus in on a couple of things. I think a lot of what you were doing was great exposition of other parts of the book that I didn't cover. Neoliberalism, I guess I think is used in a lot of different ways by a lot of different people. My discussion of it is sort of happening in the book, but without using that word. I think of neoliberalism as something in which people privilege economic rights over political rights, and don't really care that much about political rights, but really want to try to somehow impose on other societies a sort of free market outcome that they think of as embodying will make possible a large set of economic rights for the people in that society. And what's kind of unattractive about this is that it's often through some form of coercion, like IMF or World Bank conditionality or US aid conditionality. It's also often involving the micromanaging of foreign experts who are deciding exactly what a free market is in someone else's society, another unattractive idea. But most of all, the big problem is simply privileging economic rights over political rights and not caring about political rights. First of all, it's self-defeating even if you only did care about economic rights, because you can't, the kind of beloved figure in this, the people that belong to the school would be sort of the free market autocrat, like Pinochet or Lee Kuan Yew, that you could sort of trust to enforce free market rules. But the sort of politics and economics 101 says you can't trust any autocrat ever to enforce any good thing that you want from them. They are going to act in their own autocratic interests, which are to stay in power through coercion and repression. You can't trust them to do anything you want. And so that is true regardless if the autocrat is talking about socialism, populism, free markets, whatever they're promising to do for whatever group, you can't trust them. That's the simple argument of the book. And so it's self-defeating even for the people who did only care about economic rights. But most of all, it's really kind of offensive to care only about poor people's economic rights and not about their political rights, and to even think that you can make a sharp distinction between the two. There's an example of a World Bank project that led to the result that soldiers with guns took farms away from Ugandan farmers and burned down their homes and torched their crops. Now, was that a violation of their political rights or their economic rights? It was really both, You really need both to protect yourself against the World Bank and against the state. And so these two, you need, there's sort of no moral justification for separating those rights. There's no kind of social science justification for separating these two separate rights. We really should want both economic rights and political rights for poor people. Both their ability to do what they can do to earn their own livelihood and their ability to constrain what the state can do to them and to protest bad things that the state does to them. That's what, there should be a unified vision of rights. The other thing I'm going to respond to is the idea of waiting for the spontaneous solution to happen, and you just need lots of patience, which leads to an agonizing moral choice. Well, let's sort of start from that and work backwards. First of all, the moral choice is more and more agonizing the more someone else has some really quick, instant, powerful solution on the table, and I don't know of any such person at this point for kind of like a quick fix to poverty or progress and development. Second, I think that's the wrong way to think about spontaneous solutions. I think we're not waiting for spontaneous solutions to happen. We are ourselves becoming part of the spontaneous solutions that already are happening. And that is true just as much in politics as it is in economics. Both are really systems that are really a system of sort of general equilibrium in which no one individual controls the outcome. The outcome is largely the unintended interaction of many economic and political actors. And so the best you can do is just be a really great political entrepreneur providing great public services that will really solve the problems of poor people. And poor people with rights will reward you in such a system by keeping you in power because you delivered such great public solutions to their problems. Or you're an economic entrepreneur with the market system. But either way, the system is really rewarding those who a system with rights is rewarding those who are successful entrepreneurs in what is inevitably in a free society a decentralized system with many, many centers of power. But it's as Greg said, it's a decentralized problem-solving system that it rewards the problem solvers. It punishes those who do not solve problems by driving them out of power with protest. Or even those who create problems it drives out of power, like our friend Governor Christie with a little traffic jam on a bridge, where he's paid enormous political grief just for a little thing like that. That's a sign of our political rights in action, that we're able to protest and speak out and make sure that no other governors ever try something so stupid again. That's a small sign of how a system of a spontaneous system that responds to rights will punish those who do bad things and reward those who do good things. And that really is a successful problem-solving system. It does mostly work in a set of societies that for some odd reason we usually leave out of the development discussion, namely those that are already developed. There's something always been very strange about the development discussions that we're not allowed to use as examples for success in development those who have actually succeeded in development. Well, in those societies that have succeeded in development, which now includes South Korea and Taiwan and Japan and other places outside of the West, this system of rights, more or less, with some oversimplification, exaggeration, of course, but for the purposes of making the point clear, is a system of rights that makes political and economic entrepreneurs flourish as problem solvers and solve society's problems and thus develop. So we're not waiting for anything. We're joining a positive thing that is already happening. And you can decide if you want to make the world a better place, you can decide what your own role is in yourself being an entrepreneur, as a political entrepreneur, an economic entrepreneur. Or you can do something else, which is you can protest the rights violations that I've talked about in this talk that are still happening today. You can become an advocate for the rights of poor people, which is sort of creating the meta system in which poor people's problems will be solved when we advocate that poor people do indeed finally get their rights, that all men are created equal.
Thank you. So let's open to the floor. Questions?
Hi.
And if you can introduce yourself, tell us your name.
Okay. My name is Belinda. I'm a PhD student in sustainable development here at Columbia. So it's just but I had a few questions I'm going to try and condense into a brief question. So first of all, on the issue of the benevolent autocrat that you mentioned that the issue with the failure of the technocratic solution is that they view these autocrats as benevolent. So I always thought that it was that, maybe erroneously they're viewing these autocrats as having very low discount rates. So, seeing that if they maximize the size of the economic pie, then they can extract as much as possible. So not necessarily they're benevolent, but just that they're self-interested parties, but with long-term horizons. So that was my first question. My second question has to do with this definition of who an autocrat is. So, for instance, what differentiates a Japan or a Sweden from a Mexico in terms of the political parties? So, predominant parties versus autocratic parties, really what's the difference? Can we really define that? My last question had to do with this idea of, again, I guess it goes back to the power of autocrats to implement these solutions. So there's a whole literature coming out, for instance, on pre-colonial Africa, so state centralization in pre-colonial Africa. So non-Michaelopoulos, all these people have written these articles saying that in states that were more centralized in pre-colonial Africa, you have better economic outcomes today. And the whole thesis hinges on the fact that you are able to, the more centralized the state was, the easier you're able to co-opt the state to produce these public services or public resources. So to me, that kind of sounds almost like an argument for a more autocratic system. So I'm just wondering.
Okay.
Thank you. So we already have 3 questions. Let's try to ask one question each, and let's collect a bit and before you reply. Is it fine for you? Is it okay?
Yeah,
okay.
Of course.
So you and then you. Okay.
Professor Easterly, thank you.
There's a few seats opening up down here if you want some relief in the gallery.
Yeah,
there.
right.
Yeah. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you and congratulations on your work.
Thank you.
I'm a Fulbright student from Afghanistan, so I agree with a lot of things that you say.
Okay. I hope the foundation is paying you a decent salary.
Yes, I mean, there is an aid industry there and all those things that you painted is correct. But I have a question, and I've read many of your books and papers. The question is this. There is a predominant aid governance in the world, and you're challenging that status quo. And it's not going anywhere. It's not going anywhere this soon. I mean, it's not changing this soon because they have been here, like you say, for 100 years. What kind of alternative approach, gradual approach, you propose to change this entire approach to aid? Because there has been a lot written on it, but the mechanisms to implement some of those new approaches and ideas has not been in place, or the institutions have not been receptive, or they were not reformed. And the second question I have is more like on the ground. I'm really sorry. I have to put this because it has to do with Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, we have many autocrats there. There are dozens of them, and one of them is running for president now.
Only one?
Yeah. But majority of the initiatives have failed because of the ownership of the people. People most of the times think that this is like an alien idea coming to them. But most of the times when they have ideas and they go to development agencies with those ideas, those prove to be very successful. How do you comment?
I'm sorry, say the last part again.
It's the question of ownership of the community.
When there is local ownership, they're successful?
Yeah, when they
Okay.
come up with their
Okay.
own ideas,
Okay.
rather than
Okay.
somebody else sitting somewhere and giving them ideas,
Okay.
these autocrats, they
Mhm.
prove to be more successful rather than the ones coming from.
Hi, my name is Frank Corva. I worked did some international development work in Venezuela and in Ghana. And there was something that you said about Ghana that I thought was interesting. Obviously, you talked a lot about it, but how they had their first successful democratic elections and how it's going well. A lot of people, and I worked on a very rural part, a lot of people would talk about the time under Rawlings when they actually said a lot more got accomplished under that time. These were they thought that there was a time when autocracy was effective, and I wanted to know if you ever thought that there was. Someone like Gallier in the bottom billion would argue that at certain points in a country's history, it is more effective to have, and sometimes in post-conflict situations, it is more effective to just have an autocrat, so you don't constantly have this battle of a democratic leader constantly spending time just fighting to stay in power versus actually getting things done. I don't know if that was clear.
Okay, well, we have already 6 questions,
Okay.
so why don't you?
I have three answers for every question. So. Let me start first. Let me start with the most recent and work backward through the questions. So we do have a few disagreements in development. I really disagree with Paul Collier. I disagree with almost every word he writes, including and the. So I disagree. This idea of that the autocrats have majority popular support, you often hear this a lot. So the only comeback to that is if they have such great majority popular support, why don't they just go ahead and have an election? And they can be Democrats. They can have an election. They have nothing to fear from an election. Why aren't they having elections? I think the fact they're not having elections, that they invest so much in the security forces and in repression, and Rawlings did some really awful things in repressing the population, and of which I've heard a lot about from my Ghanaian friends. That's suggesting that they themselves don't think they had such a clear popular mandate as many other people seem to think they do. Local ownership, great, I agree with you, great point. On the aid governance status quo, there's always this sort of evolution versus revolution question. I really want a revolution and overthrow the aid establishment. I don't want it to be violent. But I really, some people really seem to miss that point, that they're saying, why aren't you telling the aid establishment how to, change Statute 1.01 of the World Bank articles to improve the functioning of the World Bank office such and such. I'm really not talking about that. I'm talking about you've really gotten the whole ideas and principles wrong. You need to, something more revolutionary is needed. Now, have such rights revolutions ever succeeded? Yeah, of course they have. I don't know what the prospects are in development. We never know what the prospects are for ideals and principles and rights. But the U.S. history itself shows a very long process of successful rights revolutions, ending slavery, some more rights for blacks, more rights for women, more rights, then even more rights for blacks in the Civil Rights Revolution. All of this still very incomplete, still more and more rights evolution needed, still much racial oppression going on today. But still, there has been at least a successful appeal to the principle of rights, which seems to be something that people are really willing to fight for and really almost literally risk their lives and go to prison for, which is not something you could say for, Statute 1.01 of the World Bank articles of people wanting to change it. So I actually think rights causes are much more powerful in the long run than you think they are. It's just we don't know when and where they will succeed, but you can campaign for them with the hope that many past ones have succeeded. And then on your question, Belinda, so there is this idea that some autocrats, they know they're going to be in power a long time, so they have a low discount rate. They want to invest in the economy because then they can tax their own economy. It sounded like a promising idea, but it hasn't really ever seemed to work out that way in practice in most cases. I think it's because in reality, the risk of being overthrown as an autocrat is often quite high. So even though ex post, some autocrats have stayed in power a long time, they didn't know that ex ante. They didn't know that they were going to be the lucky ones that would survive in power a long time, unlike most autocrats that lose power after not a very long time in office. And also, the ones who do stay in power a long time, sometimes they stay in power by things that they have to do that really undevelop the economy, not having low discount rates to do. They don't want the people educated because educated people rebel. They don't want the infrastructure to work all that well because that makes it easier for dissidents. So there are lots of, and they want to expropriate anyone who becomes a power threat, or either an economic power threat or a political power threat, and that discourages investment. So there, lots of what autocrats have to do to stay in power is very bad for development. And so that goes against this other idea that they could just have this low discount rate. So should we take more?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Aaron Ross. I'm a journalist.
Yeah, we've been emailing. Hi, how are you?
I was wondering what you think is a justifiable role for technocrats when it comes to development. Should the World Bank and other development specialists just be advocating on behalf of the rights of the poor, or are there sort of development specific sort of traditional aid technocratic approaches that are justifiable in your estimation?
My question just is
Yeah.
that one, which is if you're a foreign actor, then if you're not choosing not to work through authoritarian regimes, you're working against them. So for a state, you're now destabilizing for a citizen risking their life. So how does that play out in terms of participating at the local level?
Okay.
You want to take it?
My name is Ricardo Guerra. I'm from the Estado de São Paulo in Brazil, and newspaper. A clear example of what you talked about was what happened to João Goulart in 1964 in Brazil.
Mm-hmm.
He was deposed,
Mm-hmm.
and a journalist from a professor from the University of São Paulo just discovered in the archives that there was a huge survey conducted in 1964. He had 85% of the support of the lower sectors of Brazilian society and 74% of all other sectors of that society, and they deposed him. And Celso Furtado, who was his Minister of the Economy and Planning at the time, had a major project for the northeastern region of the country called Sudene. And obviously when he was deposed, all of this social project and the health projects that they had in place that had more of a socialistic orientation were all put aside when the military dictatorship came in. From 1964 to 1974, all health indicators in the country decreased significantly. It's shameful what happened. So my question is, even though we have a democracy now, it seems that these ideas, the technocratic ideas imposed by different international organizations, still predominate over ideas by local academics and economists that actually know the situation of the country better than the guy that is sitting in Washington, D.C. So what do you say to that? That even though we have a democracy, but these technocratic ideas are still winning the day and being imposed, even though we have a president that has been there from the same party for 12 years, the PT, which has a socialistic orientation.
Okay. So on the questions of rights, what role do they give technocrats? Well, I think I forgot to actually define the word technocrat. So technocracy was a made-up word, actually made up around the time that Woodrow Wilson was talking about his brilliant ideas for development in 1919. It literally meant rule of experts. So technocrats are those who are, the experts ruling the society. So the point I'm making is I don't think there should be technocrats. I don't think experts should rule. So I don't see any role for technocrats, but I do see a role for experts. That's the difference. Experts, and I think you said the one word you took away from the book was patience. I would say I would prefer the word humility. That experts should be willing to themselves be subject to a process of democratic accountability. That a democratically accountable system will use experts. Of course, we use all kinds of specialized experts in solving a lot of our problems, including some of the public problems. You do really need an expert on highway systems to build a system of highways. But the point is that an expert on how to get a clean water system to keep the water clean, and how to get, you need sanitary experts to make sure that New York has clean water and that we dispose of our wastes in ways that do not contaminate the water around us. All these are expert problems to be solved by experts, but the point is they're accountable to the citizens. And when they get things wrong in the service of whomever public official they're working for, then they pay a democratic penalty for getting things wrong. That the citizens will protest, you're not solving our problem, you're getting it wrong, or they'll be rewarded when they get it right. They become the go-to guy to, this is the guy who really knows how to clean up the water when a politician really wants to stay in office longer on a platform of cleaning up the water. So it's, they are democratically accountable. They do have a role when they are democratically accountable. That's the answer to your question. So this idea of when you're supporting sort of freedom for some other people against the autocrat that they're resisting, that is a hard problem. I'm not going to say it's not a hard problem. Definitely, we're not talking about foreigners actively going in. Certainly, we're not talking about the U.S. Army invading the country and imposing democracy. That's ridiculous. This is really the stupidest idea ever. It was really, the whole idea that if freedom means that freedom basically means that you are uncoerced, that no one is coercing you. So it's a pretty stupid idea to have the idea that you need an army to coerce someone else to be uncoerced. Someone else an army to coerce other people to have the right to be uncoerced. It just doesn't make sense. It's a contradiction. And the same with any kind of intentional kind of CIA, U.S. Army, DOD, or even private citizen plot to destabilize and overthrow a foreign government. It's not going to go well. It's not a good idea. It's going to backfire. That's not the way to promote a free government in some other society. What you can do is you can refrain from doing actions that support the party, the autocrat in power. So, why are we giving aid to autocrats? Why are we praising autocrats? Some of the autocrats in Africa, like say Museveni in Uganda, has been in power for 20 years, gets praised, he's kind of using this capital up a lot over time as his behavior gets worse and worse, but he's been praised for many years now as being kind of the father of Ugandan development and doing all the good things for Uganda's development. You don't need to praise the autocrats. So, Bill Gates is praising autocrats. You don't have to. USAID is financing autocrats. You don't have to. Those are the things that you could stop doing. And you can promote the ideas. I think, dissidents in the West, in Africa, they get extremely encouraged when they see the West, people in the West supporting them and supporting the denial of U.S. government support to the autocrat that is oppressing them, but also supporting the ideas of freedom and their right to be free and protesting specific imprisonments of political prisoners like Eskinder Nega, a dissident who was sentenced to 18 years in prison just for writing a blog in Ethiopia. I've heard from people related to him and his wife and child, like, this is great that you are just speaking out against what the U.S. government is doing to oppress this guy. I think that's a positive contribution, to just at least be on the side of the oppressed in the realm of ideas. You're not kind of like a secret agent trying to overthrow a government. You're just an open public spokesman for ideals that we can all believe in. The idea that poor people as well as rich people should have rights, should have political rights, should have economic rights.
Can I just ask you one last question? And your final point. My name is Elham. I'm a PhD student in political science. The question I have is, we were just talking about the realm of ideas. How can we implement that? How can we operationalize that? How can we support the people on the ground while at the same time not supporting the autocrats? Because to me it sounds, I'm just trying to see how we can make this more implementable, actionable. Because it sounds great, yes, we're not going to be supporting the autocrats and let's do away with the aid infrastructure and the current autocratic global governance structure that we have. But at the same time, there are people on the ground who do need resources. They need shelter. They need food. They are sick. How can we make that distinction while at the same time, not upholding that autocratic regime, but helping the people?
I sympathize very much with what you're saying. This book says right away at the beginning, this is not a book that is going to help you in your job if you're a philanthropist or aid worker or NGO worker. Let's think of the sort of U.S. civil rights revolution as an analogy. You start with a situation where there's an ideal that is not recognized. That there's a principle that blacks and whites should have equal rights that is not recognized among white Southerners. And then you get a campaign that is is simply stressing that principle is wrong, that the principle of unequal rights, of segregation is wrong, and campaigning against that as a principle, and trying to get people to change their minds to a different principle, to recognize the hypocrisy, to accept that all American citizens should have equal rights. That's a powerful principle. And that was a vehicle for social change. It was operationalized by protest, by sit-ins at lunch counters, by freedom rides, by demonstrations in Selma and Montgomery, and the bus boycotts, and all these specific tactics for change. But it all stemmed from the principle. So I agree very much there is still the problem that I'm not being very helpful with on how NGO workers and philanthropists do their jobs. But we've spent all our energy in development talking about helping those people do their jobs. I think we should spend some of our energy talking about the principles. I'm looking for the sort of Martin Luther Kings, and other people around the world are looking for sort of the Martin Luther Kings of the civil rights revolution for poor people around the rest of the world. And when they give their I Have a Dream speech, we're not going to say to them, well, how do you make I Have a Dream actionable? We recognize that there's progress, that it's not just rhetoric, that it's a principle that you point out as being hypocritically and systematically not recognized by people who should recognize it. And that in itself, as a principle, is a powerful agent for social change. I wish we had time for more for the principles and the ideas, and we weren't always bogged down only in the day-to-day work that ignores these principles.
Okay, well, I think the stress on principles is a good point where to close our discussion. And so, again, let's thank Bill Easterly and Greg Lamb.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for coming. Thank you. Thank you.
Appreciate you taking the question. Thank you.
Yeah, if you don't mind signing. Oh, sure.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it. It really, I'm not a massive fan of Kalia either, which is kind of the reason I asked the question, so I appreciate it.
I really still stand for
Thank you so much.
Sure, my pleasure. Yeah, nice to meet you.
So I do anthropology and literature,
Yeah, economists don't. It's usually so it's like I mean, we perceive it as a right. So I mean, I'm sympathetic with
Okay.
He said that he said interview.
I don't know.
No, I can know you.
Yeah, it's okay.
Yeah, I know.
Yes,
Nice to meet you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Last time I said it was here.
Yeah, well.